Oh. I have not seen her walk in yet. Now, Suzanne, if you're here, please raise your hand so we can find you. How's that? Eric, you going to ring the bell? Good morning, everyone. I can make you really nervous and say we're going to start Job all over again. But that's not what I promised you last week. So we are going to begin a study this week. We're beginning the study, and we're looking at post-exilic prophets. And hopefully Eric can get our slide up there. So I've got a couple of slides that we're going to share for the introduction piece. I just kind of want to talk about who the post-exilic prophets are. There he is. That's not what he meant to go get, but he'll find it. That will scare you all out of the room, will it not? You know what, Eric? It looks like maybe the presentation is off on the laptop. There we go. All right. So the three prophets that we're going to be looking at are Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And if you didn't read ahead and you're not sure where to find them, turn to that separation between the Old and the New Testament and back up 3 books, and you'll be there because they're the last 3 that we find recorded in the Old Testament in the order that we have it today. Okay? Each of these men are chosen by God to bring a specific message to the Jewish people. But we have to understand that this is the part of Israel that is Judah, right? So we understood in the past there was the entire kingdom, then it became a divided kingdom of Israel and Judah. And the people that we're seeing addressed here are the people from Judah. And where did they go off into captivity? Do you remember? Babylon, yes. Do you remember where Israel went off into captivity to? Assyria, thank you. So this is going to be the Jewish returnees who come back to Judah from Babylon. And over time, God is going to send them 3 prophets after this time that they return. We're also going to look at some historical context that we hope will put all of this in perspective for us, as well as some other relevant Old Testament scripture that's going to help us with them as well. Our modern concept of a prophet, when we think of a prophet, or the world thinks of a prophet today, they're thinking of somebody who tells the future, right? But in biblical terms, that's not necessarily what is meant by a prophet. A prophet is often someone who is called upon by God to deliver a specific message that needs to be conveyed. Sometimes it includes that idea of foreshadowing things that are going to come, but that's really not the basis of being a prophet that we find in the Old Testament. While the books of Zechariah and Malachi do both include some of that foreshadowing of future events, that's not, again, back to not the purpose of calling them a prophet. We consider them prophets because they are chosen to deliver specific messages. So I wonder, there we go. So I think we were probably supposed to be on this slide that whole time I was just talking. Nothing there that I didn't already say. Okay, that's just kind of the summary of my points. There we go. So we're on to slide 2. So the nation of Israel and later the divided kingdom, we talked about Israel and Judah, that we see described throughout the Old Testament, that ranges from the time of the Exodus, when God led them out of Egypt, and that captivity that they were in there, through the close of the book of Malachi, which is the final book we have recorded in the Old Testament as it's ordered today. We see a people that ran really hot and cold in terms of their faithfulness and dedication to God. At times, they were very faithful people. They worshiped only God. They conducted things the way God asked them to do. But over time, they would start to slip. They would start to introduce other gods. We read repeatedly of other gods being worshipped throughout the Old Testament amongst the Jewish people. And to a large extent, it was the influence of the people around them. So these were gods that the people around them worshiped. But it was also partly as a result of them allowing themselves to be intermingled with those other cultures. Do you remember when they came out of Egypt and they were to settle in the promised land? It took them an extra 40 years because they were stubborn. But when they finally got there, what was God's message to them about the people who already inhabited these lands? Were they to make friends with them, make them part of their families? Of course not. He said, if they're not willing to leave, you just destroy them. And that seems really harsh to us. But we need to understand that there was a reason for that. God did not want them influenced by these people. And he knew that if they allowed them to remain, if they became friends with them, if they intermarried with them, they were going to affect them in ways that God did not want them affected. The concept of people who have a set of rules and do it well at times and not so well at times. Do we have any modern examples we can think of right off the tops of our heads that fit that category? I think of parents and children, right? As parents, we set what we expect to be the standard of their behavior, right? And at times, our kids do a really good job of that. And at other times, they struggle with it. Not because they don't want to do what we tell them, but because they have influences from around them. They have peers, they have friends whose families don't necessarily share those same values. And they get pressure put upon them to do things that they know they probably shouldn't do. And they struggle with that. I think we can look at that similar relationship between us and God. Sometimes we're really good about following what he asks of us, and other times the world makes it really challenging and we stumble. When those instances occur, when either our kids stumble or we stumble, what is the proper response of a parent? Is it to say, well, I guess they'll just go do their own thing? Hopefully not. Hopefully as a parent, you're still engaged with them. You're still trying to help them make the right decisions, influence them in a positive way, right? Sometimes that involves the word discipline. Do we do discipline because we want to punish them? No. We do discipline because we want to help them see the error of their way and to recognize that there are consequences for negative choices. Sometimes those consequences are fairly small and they go away quickly, right? Other times there are choices we make in life, bad choices we make in life that have consequences that last the rest of our lives and affect other people for the rest of their lives. Discipline is a part of teaching. And this is what we've seen throughout their history. They stray away, and eventually God will discipline them. So how might he discipline? At times, he uses other nations to overpower them, right? So someone comes in and makes things very uncomfortable for them for a period of time. And over that time, they eventually realize, boy, things aren't what they're supposed to be. Let's call and ask God, call upon God and ask for help out of this situation. That will last for a while, and God will send a messenger of some type to point out to them that I'm not the one who walked away from this relationship. If you'd like to restore this relationship, you're going to need to make some changes. So we see this going on for centuries, where the situation is remedied by God in many cases, or we have a whole period of time where God raises up people we refer to as judges, right? That's another term that means something very different today to us than it meant in this context. We think of a judge as someone who hears the arguments between two people or two organizations and renders a decision on who has better ground, right? Who's more. There's never an absolute, well, there's rarely an absolute truth. Usually a judge has to choose who has a better truth, right? But judges are a very different concept here throughout the Old Testament. These are people who are sent to lead the people out of whatever problem it is they're in, oftentimes in multiple aspects. So typically they weren't just in trouble because another nation was oppressing them. They were in trouble because they were spiritually wrong. So the judge would have to not only lead them in the sense of overcoming that oppressor, but also make it clear to them, help them to understand that they're in this situation because of their spiritual sickness, and help them to correct that. We do have a couple of examples of judges who led truly just more of a spiritual restoration. It was less about being occupied and more about calling people back to a proper relationship with God. And eventually we reach a period in time where the people of Israel look around them and they see something that all the nations around them have that they don't. And they feel like, well, we're missing out here somehow by not having that. What was that? A king. We don't have a physical leader who is the figurehead of our nation. And yet, did they truly need a king? They had the ultimate king, did they not? God was their king, their leader. They had no real need for a human king. It was simply their envy of what they saw of the nations around them. First king who was chosen, and this was at God's direction, was Saul, who was the son of Kish. In time, he's followed by the line that we read of David, David leading to Solomon and on down through. Israel enjoyed its greatest height as a world power during the reign of Solomon. He is recognized to be one of the wisest men. Leaders would come from nations all around to ask him advice on things. Why was Solomon so wise? Was he? Yes. So he wasn't really born with it. But when God gave him the opportunity, what is it you would desire from me? Solomon was at least already smart enough to say, give me wisdom. He didn't say, give me all the wealth, give me all the power, give me the greatest armies. He said, give me wisdom that I could lead this nation well. And that's what God granted him. The nation of Israel was paid tribute by the nations around them because of this recognition of how powerful Israel had become, how wise their leader was, and they respected them. The nations around them respected them. But all of these blessings that they enjoyed were because of their good relationship with God. It was not because they themselves were great people or had built a nation that everyone else should envy. I'm not sure how well you can see that. I apologize. That looked a whole lot better on my computer. It was nice and wide and the text was bigger. So the end of Solomon's reign brought great turmoil to Israel. It fractured as a result. There was great dissension among Solomon's family at first as to who would be the next leader. There was a lot of infighting among his family as to who would be the next king. Not that was a first. I mean, that even happened with Solomon becoming king. There was great infighting, upon David potentially stepping down. But this created great division within the nation, and eventually Rehoboam succeeds Solomon, his son Rehoboam. But he creates an even greater division. The people had come to him and said, we've been your father was almost like an oppressor. He put a lot of demands on us. He made life a lot more difficult than it needed to be. If you want us to be faithful servants of you, we're asking you to make some changes, to be more realistic, to lighten the load a little bit. Rehoboam has the choice of two groups of people to influence him. And as so often happens, he chooses the wrong group. He chooses his friends, who are young like him, and their response is, hey, not only don't lighten things up, tell them you're going to make it twice as hard on them. That'll straighten them out. They'll never come back and ask for something again. That backfires. That creates the split that we end up then with the nation of Israel separate from the nation of Judah. Judah, though, is still home to Jerusalem and the temple. Does it include any tribe other than Judah? Benjamin, yes. So Benjamin remains as well. But the end result of this is that it leaves both nations less powerful, less able to defend themselves. They don't have the strength that they once had under Solomon because now they're divided. They're not only dealing with the nations around them, but they're also bickering and fighting between themselves. So they've weakened the entire nation of Israel through these actions. They're neither the military power nor the economic power that they once were. Northern kingdom of Israel is overcome beginning in 732 BC. I have a feeling maybe we're supposed to be a slide forward. Depending on whose dating methods you prefer. So you read one commentator, they put it at 732, some put it at 740. It's all how they start counting dates, right? So over the span of approximately 10 years, the Assyrian nation, which overtook the northern kingdom of Israel, carries away the vast majority of people that are in that nation. They settle them in other lands. That was common practice when you overcame another nation. You wanted to take the people out of their homeland, put them somewhere else, put them somewhere where they did not feel connected to the land and did not feel a need to feel possessive of it, right? So you were less likely to resist the Assyrian nation because it wasn't your own homeland that you were feeling you were protecting. Okay. Judah lasts another 80 years or so after the capture of Israel, but they too are conquered by a foreign power of Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar. Babylon actually takes control of Judah around 605 BC, but did not immediately begin deporting everyone. At first, they just chose what they considered to be the choice people, right? So here we have that example where we meet Daniel. He's among those choice people who they take away. And he had three friends that we read about in Daniel's account of that time in captivity: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The bulk of the remaining people were relocated by the Babylonians, again, over another 10-year span. So it seems to be a consistent thing here. It takes about 10 years to get everybody out. That begins around 597 BC and was completed around 586 BC. At the late stages of the relocation, there's been an insurrection by the people who remain in Judah. They're attempting to resist Babylon at this point. As you can imagine, by this point, Babylon's an enormous power, and the few who are left in Judah are certainly no match for the forces that can be sent to deal with them. The Babylonian king is offended by this and decides he's going to punish those who remain, destroying the city, destroying the temple that was originally built by Solomon. It was torn to the ground, and anything that was left was burned. This left no remnant of that temple, the connection that the people had to their God. They were taken away into captivity in Babylon, so again, they would not feel a connection to the land, would be less likely to resist Babylon, and that they would remain then subservient to the Babylonians. So I have a note here. I jumped a slide early. Sorry, you had to look at that for a whole extra time that you didn't really need to. So hopefully this slide gives us a kind of a timeline to understand the events that make up the return. So all this time up to now, we've talked about how the nations were carried away, right? They remained in captivity for just over 70 years in Babylon before they're going to be given the opportunity to return home. So this slide begins with those actions that lead to the return. In 539 BC, while Judah was still in captivity in Babylon, Persia overthrows Babylon. Persia was led by King Cyrus. In the following year, in 538 BC, we read that Cyrus is moved by God. We find this in Ezra chapter 1. So here we're told that Cyrus is moved by God to allow the captive Jews to return to Judah. Cyrus decrees that any Jewish captive who was taken in the Babylonian capture of Judah, who wants to return to Jerusalem, may do so, but with the understanding that their purpose for going is to re-inhabit the land and to rebuild the temple. This is why God has moved Cyrus to allow them, is so that the temple can be rebuilt. This is to fulfill the promise that God had made to the people, telling them that they would return, that they would be able to return from captivity after 70 years. There's a very positive response to this offer by the Jewish people. Nearly 50,000 people return in the initial group. Among them are 42,360. Interesting that we count them down to that level of accuracy. But over 42,000 who return who can trace their ancestry to Judah. Whether that be they were born in Judah, which would make them 70 plus, or whether they were born in captivity to people who were taken from Judah. In addition, they take with them another 7,337 servants who don't have an ancestral connection to Judah, but had become connected to them in one way or another during their time in Babylon. In addition to allowing them to return, Cyrus also has all of the implements of worship that were taken from the temple by the Babylonians. He has one of his treasurers go into the stores and find all of those items and take them out to be sent back with those who are returning so that they will have all of the necessary implements of worship. So if you have any question about whether this was just Cyrus himself coming up with these ideas, do you think a Persian king would have ever bothered to have looked up to see that, oh, we have all of these implements that they need in the temple, let's send them with them? Of course not. This is God at work. The return begins around the end of 538 BC or early 537. It takes several months for them to make the physical trip. You can't just arrange for a couple of buses or a train. You got to walk it. They're led by two men who we'll encounter as we begin our studies. Zerubbabel is the one who will serve as the administrator, the government person, let's say. He's essentially the person designed to be the governor or administrator in the state with Cyrus's permission. The other person is variously referred to as Jeshua or Joshua. He could be traced to the priestly line from Aaron and was to return as the high priest, understanding that once they did successfully rebuild the temple, they would need a high priest to preside over services. So Cyrus not only approved of the rebuilding of the temple and the resumption of worship, but he encouraged the people to do it and provided the means necessary to accomplish it. After they'd returned and been there for approximately a year to a year and a half, the people had had enough time to build some basic shelters for themselves, possibly restore some of the houses that were there that had fallen into disrepair, and they've got enough that they can live and have a place, to be safe from the elements. So they begin the task of rebuilding the temple in 536 BC, laying the stones that would be the foundation of the temple. As they begin this work, what always happens? The people around them, they're a little nervous. Who are all these people that have come back? There hasn't been anybody over there in Judah for 70 years. What are all these people doing back, and what are they up to? What do people do when they get nervous? They try to foil your plans. That's what the people end up doing, or at least trying. They saw them as a threat to their standing, so the people around them actually worked together to make it difficult for the Jewish people to make progress building the temple. Eventually, the plot includes writing to the new king of the Persian Empire, Artaxerxes, who had succeeded Cyrus. They suggest to him that the work that was going on in Jerusalem wasn't a good thing, that he should look at the records of the past and he'd see what an unreliable and untrustworthy group of people these Jewish people were. And it's probably not in his best interest to allow this work to continue. That's basically what their letter is implying. Look at the records, see what you can find out about these people. I don't think you want to let them keep doing this. When the letter arrives, Artaxerxes has his scholars look up the records they have of the Jewish people. And what he finds is things like the uprising at the end of the Babylonian, where they were evacuating the people, that uprising that occurred, he finds that. He finds records of what a powerful nation this had once been. And those things kind of concern him. A, well, these are rebellious people. B, if they're allowed to restore everything, they may become that great nation again who overpowers us. So as a result, he issues a decree that they must stop the work. The letter was sent and executed among the Jews in 534 BC, so they've had about 2 years to work on the temple. The Jews comply. They go back to essentially worrying about their own needs, their personal needs. They work on their houses, make them nicer. They did their best to plant crops and work on things like vineyards and groves of trees that would produce food. The needs of everyday life had taken priority in their lives. They no longer focused on the work that they'd been sent to accomplish, which was to rebuild the temple. And the temple sat without progress for many years. In 520 BC, we're going to see that Haggai is called by God to deliver a message to the people that they need to resume the work of building the temple. Their lot in life has not been great up to this point. They plant crops, they don't produce very well. They raise animals, they don't produce very well. They don't grow strong, they don't produce a lot of offspring. They're barely scraping by, is their situation. They're not sure why. Haggai is going to explain to them exactly why it's not been going well, and that's because of their failure to fulfill the mission that God had given them. If they had focused on what they should have focused, God would have blessed them. They would have been successful. They're struggling because they failed to be focused. Zechariah will be called by God to deliver a message soon after Haggai begins. There's an overlap in these two prophets, actually within the same year. Haggai's work as a spokesman for God is a pretty short period of time in terms of what is recorded for us, so it only lasts less than a year. Zechariah's, on the other hand, we will encounter recordings that span about 5 or 6 years. Their combined efforts were very successful. They prompt Zerubbabel, the administrator, and Joshua, the priest, as they should, and it spurs the people to get back to work. So what do you think happens when work begins again? The people around them get nervous again. Well, they weren't supposed to do this. The king said they couldn't. They try to intercede, try to stop them, And basically they're told we're going to continue this work because it's what God has told us to do. So the people around write another letter to the Persian king, who is now Darius, and he orders the records to be searched. But instead of focusing on the records about the rebellion and the past history of Israel, what he finds is the decree from Cyrus that said this was exactly what the king had ordered they go do. His response is, well, this is crazy. The king said to go do this. They should be doing it. And that's exactly what he sends a letter saying, go back to your work, continue to work on the temple. And his letter actually tells those around them, if you interfere again, you'll not only answer to whatever God they have, but you're going to answer to the Persian Empire. And I'm sure to some extent, because of their lack of understanding of who God is and what he's capable of, that part probably made them a little more nervous. The temple is completed in 516 BC. There's a period of relative calm. The next events we have recorded for us begin in 458 BC, when Ezra will lead a large second contingent of returnees to Babylon. From Babylon back to Jerusalem. Several years later, we encounter the events that are recorded in Nehemiah, where he returns. He has heard in Babylon of how the city walls have not been rebuilt. There's a lack of safety. It troubles him, and he gets the king's permission to return and lead that work. And then in 430 BC, we encounter the final prophet that we're going to address in this study, and that's Malachi. And he's called by God to tell the Jewish people to change their ways, that they again become slack, and as their history showed them doing over and over again, and that God has sent this messenger, Malachi, to help them get back to where they need to be. So, if you're interested in reading other text that is going to help us understand this, and at times I'm going to pull some of this in, but these are interesting reads that help put some of these things in context. 2 Kings chapter 17 recounts the captivity of the northern kingdom of Israel by Assyria. 2 Kings chapter 24 through the close of the book, as well as 2 Chronicles chapter 36, provide the account of the conquest and captivity of Judah by Babylon. The book of Daniel gives us an excellent account of their time in Babylonian captivity from the perspective of Daniel, who was one of the earliest captives taken from Judah. Many scholars believe that Daniel did live long enough to see Cyrus' decree that they could return, but of course, he would have been in his 80s or 90s by that time. He himself does not return. Now, we don't actually have that recorded. This is Jewish tradition that Daniel lived to see that decree made. If we look at the book of Ezra, who doesn't return to Jerusalem until later, we can read the history of the return that he compiles in chapters 1 through 6. So while he was not a participant in that return, he takes the time to speak to others, learn about the things that transpired during that time and their experiences when they returned, and records them for us. Ezra chapter 7 through the close of that book, and then also the book of Nehemiah, we have the return of Ezra himself and his role in invigorating the spiritual commitment of the nation, as well as Nehemiah's return and his work in fortifying the city. Nehemiah serves as a city administrator for a number of years with the permission of the king. So let's see. So that pretty much wraps up everything I had for the intro. And it took a lot longer than when I rehearsed it. It only took me about 20 minutes to get through that when I wasn't sitting here thinking of other things. That's the danger. You write notes, and as I write the notes about the things I want to talk about, I tend to try to summarize or not include everything that I read from everybody. And then as we start going through the study, I think, well, I should really tell you about this other thing. So extras get added in. Anybody have any questions or comments about the overview? Again, I would encourage you when you have the opportunity, read those materials. they really do provide information from a different perspective of the three men that we're going to read, but relate to a lot of the same things that we're going to read about. All right, with that said, we're going to begin our actual study of Haggai. Because we've got 10 minutes. We can probably get through a whole 2 verses the way I talk. We're going to start by reading the first chapter of Haggai through. I'm reading from the ESV. In the 2nd year of Darius the king, in the 6th month, on the 1st day of the month, the word of the Lord came by the hand of Haggai the prophet to Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua the son of Jehozadak, the high priest. Thus says the Lord of hosts, these people say the time has not yet come to rebuild the house of the Lord. Then the word of the Lord came by the hand of Haggai the prophet. Is it a time for you yourselves to dwell in your paneled houses, while this house lies in ruins? Now therefore, says the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. You've sown much and harvested little. You eat, but you never have enough. You drink, but you never have your fill. You clothe yourselves, but no one is warm, and he who earns wages does so to put them in a bag with holes. Thus says the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. Go up to the hills and bring wood and build the house, that I may take pleasure in it, and that I may be glorified, says the Lord. You looked for much, and behold, it came to little. And when you brought it home, I blew it away. Why, declares the Lord of hosts? Because of my house that lies in ruins, while each of you busies himself with his own house. Therefore the heavens above you have withheld the dew, and the earth has withheld its produce. And I have called for a drought on the land and on the hills, on the grain, the new wine, the oil, on what the ground brings forth, on man and beast, and on all their labors. Then Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest, with all the remnant of the people, obeyed the voice of the Lord their God, and the words of Haggai the prophet, as the Lord their God had sent them. And the people feared the Lord. Then Haggai, the messenger of the Lord, spoke to the people with the Lord's message. I am with you, declares the Lord. And the Lord stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and the spirit of Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest, and the spirit of all the remnant of the people. And they came and worked on the house of the Lord of hosts, their God, on the 24th day of the month, in the 6th month, in the 2nd year of Darius the king. Chapter 1. So we get to skip the background stuff, so I was having here, that was going to be the next lesson. So since you just listened to the background and the overview, no need to go over that. You're spared that. We're going to look at verse 1. So this opening verse provides a time frame for the writing that we're about to take a look at, the first one. It's in the 2nd year of King Darius. Darius is king of the Persian Empire. If you recall, Cyrus had allowed the Hebrews to return in 538 BC. And 2 years after they got there, they started laying the foundations of the temple. They worked for 2 years, and then the work was stopped. 14 years later, so 18 years after the initial return begins, in 520 BC, Haggai is called to be God's messenger, a prophet. We encounter these characters as Zerubbabel and Joshua, or Jeshua, depending on what translation you're reading. And they had been the leaders who brought the people back in 538 BC. So they're still here. They're still prominent among the people. But we're going to discover they've been less than ideal leaders because they've allowed this to become a slack situation. we've got at least enough time for verse 2. Notice that it starts with, "Thus says the Lord of hosts." So Haggai here makes no claim that I'm in any position to tell you what to do. I'm not a leader. That's Zerubbabel, who's the administrator. I'm not your spiritual leader. That's Joshua. This message isn't from me. God has sent me with a message for you. You don't need to listen to me. I'm nobody. I'm Haggai. You know me. I'm nobody. But God sends this message, so you do need to listen to it. In it, God goes on to say, the people of this time, people say the time has not yet come to rebuild the house of the Lord. Now, do you think people were really saying that? Well, we shouldn't be building the house yet, rebuilding the temple. There were some who made the argument that the 70 years weren't up because it depended on when you took the timing to begin the 70 years. You started from when captivity began, when everybody was finally taken away. Some people were making the argument, well, it's not going well for us because we're too early here. We need to wait the 70 years. Well, guess what? The 70 years has well passed by this point, and they still hadn't picked it back up. So that argument's mute. I think what is really being said here is they're suggesting, oh, we shouldn't be working on the temple yet. Let's focus on our own needs, is the thing I think that really disturbs him most. They have left the mission that he gave him, and they're focusing on their own needs. So God states that the work of rebuilding the temple has not been completed because these people aren't willing to accomplish it for some reason. There had been a good start. They'd done 2 years of good work, but they allowed themselves to be taken away from the work. So they gave a couple rationalizations. We talked about, was the 70 years of captivity up or not? That was one of the arguments that may have been made. They make the arguments that they don't have the resources. They're not wealthy. They don't have that many people, 50,000. And they didn't necessarily have all the building materials right at hand that they needed. And yet they had all the building materials they needed to fix up their own homes. Interesting argument there, right? Partly argue that, well, we're barely getting by. I hardly have the energy to go work on the temple. I barely have enough to eat and to keep my own family fed. It requires hard work. Most people simply aren't willing to undertake hard work, are they? And lastly, an argument that may have been made is if God wanted this to be done already, he would have made it a whole lot easier. And I think that's one of the things we fall into, right? If God wanted me to follow this rule, it wouldn't be so hard to not follow it. And that's not the truth. Those are excuses. They couldn't really argue against the task. They had volunteered, every one of them, to come back and do this task when Cyrus offered the opportunity. So all they can argue about here maybe is the timing of getting it done. If I keep putting it off, I'll be old enough they won't ask me to do it. The next generation will have to do it, right? And then the other thing I really wanted to pull out of this was that God refers to them as these people. He doesn't say my people. He says these people, and we're going to see that multiple times here. These people, you're not behaving at all like my people, and that's the problem. That's why you're struggling. That's why you're suffering. That's why we're not making progress on the temple. You're not behaving like my people. When you start to, things will change. So we're going to stop there rather than moving on. So we will pick up with verses 3 and 4 next week. Thank you.